Hey guys, Coach Logan here, going over this past week's game of the week. This was between Anushka and Wesley. Just making sure I'm pronouncing that right. Yes, Anushka and Wesley. And it's a very interesting game in a very interesting line. So let's take a look. E4. Anushka was playing white. E5, knight f3, knight c6. So we get an Italian. C3, knight to f6, and here we get sort of the fast Italian with d4. I'd say at the top levels you're seeing probably more d3. You do see d4, but after takes maybe a little bit more of pawn to e5 here than what was played in the game, which was c takes d4. However, it's still a reasonably principled move. White is grabbing control of the center. So black plays bishop to b4 check, which is the best move. Basically immediately putting pressure on the e4 pawn, because after knight to c3, black is now able to take this, counting on the pin on this knight. However, white plays the move castles here, and black plays bishop takes c3. It's worth noting that knight takes c3 is really not what black wants to do. After b takes c3, black should probably at this point just move his bishop back somewhere like e7, although I think white gets pretty good compensation for the sacrificed pawn at that point. But just to show, if he were to get really greedy and play something like bishop takes c3, this gets kind of fun. White now has the very nice move bishop to a3, which freezes the black king in the center. And, for instance, if black were to get really greedy here and just keep on, taking what's in front of him, then rook e1 check is just absolutely devastating. Black's only moves to block, only moves to get out of check or to block on e7, so say something like knight e7. And after rook takes e7, black at this point will need to give up the queen, just to stay alive. But after, queen takes a1, white has a material advantage and a continuing attack. And of course, black can try to avoid giving away the queen, but then he'll find himself checkmated after a series of discovered and double checks. There's other lines in that line, but I really just don't think knight takes c3 is what black wants at all. Bishop takes c3 is a much better move. And here, white plays one of the more challenging lines, pawn to d5, just, not rushing to grab this back, because if he were to do so, then I think pawn to d5 sort of settles the position. Black is up a pawn and is more or less consolidated, so white keeps the fire kind of burning with pawn to d5, inconveniencing this knight on c6. Here, black plays the move knight to e5. Bishop f6 is also a move, but knight to e5 is one as well. And white plays b takes c3. Black plays knight takes c4. And at the moment, black is up a piece, but his king is still in the center, and he's somewhat uncoordinated. So white plays rook e1. I actually think the most interesting move here is queen to d4, or at least, a very interesting move is queen to d4, which attacks the two knights as well as this pawn on g7. Black could, of course, just castle here and allow white to recapture a knight, and then sort of have a debate about a position like this, where white is down a pawn, but, with the pawn on d5 and stuff like maybe pawn to c4 or bishop to b2, or, coming, like, does white have compensation? I don't know. It's an interesting position. I probably think black is. I would probably take black there. But if black were to try to be, greedy here and hold on to the knight with something like knight c to d6, then it gets very interesting. After queen takes g7, hitting the rook. Obviously, after rook to f8, white would clearly have, a strong attacking chances with black's king out in the center. So if black tries to simplify with queen f6, though, which makes a lot of sense. Black is up a piece. His king is in the center. Get queens off the board. Seems like it should do the trick. It turns out that even with queens off the board, white still has very strong attack. Maybe just a winning one. Rook e1 check is extremely powerful. Black, at this point, should probably just put one of his knights back to block the check. But again, if he tries to be greedy, he just loses on the spot. For instance, if king to d8, then bishop to g5 is just a deadly pin. There's no real dealing with this. If knight to e8, if like knight to e4, well, we could just take this, and they're still hanging on f6, so that's a non-starter. But same thing with knight to d8 is white can just sack the rook for the knight. And after, say, if something like rook takes, then bishop takes f6, and well, white's going to win. After something like rook e7 and rook e1, this should just be over. So that would be bad. But if rook e1 check and if king f8, which also seems to make some sense, okay, black is trying to avoid his king getting caught in a horrible pin. Well, then we see bishop h6 and king g8. And again, even though black at the moment is up a full piece, his king is just so horribly placed here on g8, where it's stuck because of our bishop on h6, and it's also blocking in this rook. And after a very strong move, rook e5, threatening rook to g5 with checkmate, black finds himself in a very difficult position trying to untangle his pieces in time. For instance, if knight d to e4, white has a very, very nice move here. I'd give the audience, I'd say pause the videos and try to figure it out, but I'm going to continue. This move, knight to d2, which is very, very strong. He could play rook e1, which is also quite good, although after d6, the game does at least somewhat continue. But knight to d2 is actually a beautiful move. Black can't take the knight because of rook to g5, but if they try something like d6, now white plays, again, very strong move, knight takes e4, just ignoring the threat. Once again, knight takes loses to rook to e8, and if the pawn takes the rook, we get this beautiful checkmate on f6, which who wouldn't love to play something like that in the game? So anyways, there's other lines. I'm not going to go through all of them, but suffice it to say, I think in this position after, just to recap, we had bishop takes c3, d5, and then this knight e5 line. I think after bc, knight takes c4, I think queen to d4 is white's best chance to make it interesting. In the game, Anushka went with rook e1, which is a logical move too, but after knight c to d6, we're finding that, okay, black is still up a piece. I doubt he's going to be able to hold it because the pin on the f-file is strong, and moves like what was played in the game, knight to g5 and f5 defending the knight, and then f3 are coming. However, keep in mind, white was down a piece and a pawn, and I think white's going to have to expend a lot of energy and resources just winning the piece back, and black will have time to consolidate into just a good, solid position, which is basically what happened. We had h6, kicking the knight with a little Zwischenzug, knight to h3, castles, takes, and it's hard to see how black is really not just up 2 pawns here for really very little. White doesn't have much of an attack going really at all. Black, you could argue black is weak on some of these light squares, but white does not have a light square bishop, is just not really able to mobilize too much pressure against black's king. We get d6, a pawn sacrifice, trying to open up lines like, again, this diagonal, which is somewhat thematic. But black plays knight e4, bishop b2, we get c6, and here queen to d4. Then we get a trade of queens, and here, though, is where I think black starts to mishandle things. Black is up at the moment 3 pawns, but white, white does have the more developed and activated pieces. I think black should prioritize shutting down white's rook on e1. So I would favor the move here, knight to e4, and just block the file. Eventually we'll do something with this bishop, maybe, I don't know, something like b6 or maybe even b5, and I think this bishop finds a home on a6, and then we can connect the rooks, and it'll take some work, but slowly but surely I think black will untangle his pieces, and the extra 3 pawns should eventually win the game. Instead, I think black rushed things a little bit with pawn to d5, and after c takes d5, knight takes d5, now white takes, and again, white is down 3 pawns, but here we're actually going to get a good lesson in piece activity, because now, after rook e7, white's pieces are just running rampant on all throughout the board. Black has to deal with especially the threat on this pawn on g7. So black plays rook to f7, which is basically the only move to really deal with that. But now after rook to e8, I think it's probably time for black to just play rook f8 and accept that this is just going to be a perpetual. Instead, in the game, understandably, black didn't want to go for this. After rook e7, rook e8. Black didn't want to go for this because he's up 3 pawns. However, after the move king h7, we see again with the activity that black is in a very annoying pin on this bishop. So after rook c1, well, black is just losing the bishop. And now his 3-pawn cushion like bought him a little bit of insurance, so it's, you know, it's still a game. It's not like white has won yet, but all of a sudden I prefer white's position. I think the bishop is going to be stronger than the 3 pawns here. Black's pawns are not, you know, greatly coordinated. You know, if you could imagine, say if these 3 pawns were sitting right now on, say, I don't know, say like on d2 and like, or not even d2, if they were just sitting like around somewhere around here, especially in concert with a pawn like on g4, then you could say, okay, these pawns are getting really scary. They're advancing up the board. But as is, the pawns are just kind of weak and, if not isolated, at least sort of alone or overextended. And I think that if white can just bring his king into the game, king f2, king e3, white should be better. So we get f5, then we get bishop e5, which I think is a first kind of step in the wrong direction. I think white should be getting his king out. That would be my priority here. King activity is really important in the endgame. Instead, we see bishop e5, and I think what happened was white felt like he was ahead in material here, which again is not quite accurate. It's a materially imbalanced position. White has a bishop for 3 pawns, and I think when you're in a position like that, keeping the rooks on the board would favor white because it would give some chances to harass the black king and to gang up on pawns and whatnot. But white went for an immediate trade of rooks, and I think that's actually to black's benefit. I think now, with the rooks off the board, black is able, his king can breathe a little bit easier. He's able to kind of get the pawns going more, which is, a bishop versus pawns in the endgame is not always so clear, especially if the pawns are far enough off the board, far up the board enough. So we get f4, bishop to b8, attacking the pawn. White managed to force the pawns onto light squares. But again, I still think we're moving in the wrong direction for white. He plays g4 here, which is swapping pawns, which I think, again, is going to work well for black. If black can, basically now at this point, if white loses his h-pawn, or trades his h-pawn even, black can never really lose this. He can just stick his king on a8, and with the wrong colored rook pawn, this is going to be a draw. So white's winning chances have really slimmed, and I think black is doing quite well here, especially after he starts to get his king active. The d pawn comes in, and now after king e4, white plays king f2, which I think is actually a fatal mistake. At this point, it's already gotten pretty scary. Black has the more active king. Black has pawn majorities on both sides of the board and a passed d pawn. This is getting scary, but I think with by playing bishop c7, white can sort of beat back the hordes of black pawns here with basically keeping the bishop sort of shifting between these diagonals as necessary. So for instance, say king to d1, and if this king starts to make progress, now bishop b6 check, and then king back to d2. Here the bishop is still covering g1, so if black defends, white can now shift back and stop this pawn from even getting to g3, and I think white should be able to hold this. Instead, we got white's king went sort of adventure-seeking with king f2, and now black's king is able to penetrate, and these pawns start to go, and that decides the game. Black actually could have just won right here with g4 takes, and then, white can't stop this anymore. He can't really leave d2 because the d pawn will just run, but at the same time, the g pawn's about to make a break for it. But if the king tries to stop that, then d2 and after something like this, black is completely winning. White will have to stop this pawn, but this pawn majority should just win on the queen side. Instead, we got, here we had h4, which is maybe not the most accurate, but black was still able to eventually win this with, these pawns sort of made a break for it, and white had to play bishop h2 because this pawn was 2 squares away from queening, and if it gets to h2, then the bishop can no longer stop it, so white had to play bishop to c7, and now black correctly just sends his b pawn, and he goes on to win after b2. He sort of toyed around with the a5, which wasn't my favorite, but at this point I think white resigned or ran out of time. The pawn's about to queen on b1, and that'll stop this pawn, and black is completely winning. All right, so a very interesting game, both in the opening, the middle game, and the end game. I mean, we saw different themes, an interesting opening line, the difference between piece activity and being ahead a bunch of pawns, and then an unbalanced endgame that ended well for the pawns. So I will see you guys next time.